most D&D players will tell you they value roleplay above combat. In a 2020 survey of over 1,000 D&D players, over 60% ranked roleplay as highly important. And yet, that same community has produced thousands of hours of content about how to deal maximum damage, with tier lists and forum posts where people debate the best damage combos with a passion that would feel right at home here in the world of Warcraft, where players reverse engineer boss fights to the millisecond. So it had me thinking, how did a game designed for unlimited human storytelling develop a community that often acts like it's playing World of Warcraft? And the answer is not a simple story. It involves a failed experiment, a multi-million-dollar correction that nobody saw coming, and a global pandemic. And it ends in a way I really didn't expect when I started researching this, with a twist that might tell us whether we're watching a tragedy or something else. But before we explore all that, we need to quickly talk about what makes D&D so different in the first place, to understand what might be at risk. So let's start here. Every video game, no matter how dense and rich, has edges. By that, I mean boundaries the developers built can only go where they made geometry and do what they wrote code for. But D&D doesn't. You can totally become friends with a dragon instead of fighting it, or open a bakery in the middle of a war campaign. The only limit you face is imagination, and another human, the DM, being willing to say yes and. You then have rules to help you figure out how things play out, but it's a lot more flexible than any video game. This is the promise that drew so many of us to this hobby. We forget about better graphics, and in exchange, we get infinite possibilities. And the thing that follows from that is you can't win at D&D. There's no score or leaderboard. The game only ends when your group stops playing. Some people could see this as a limitation, but it's actually the point. And no win conditions means optimization becomes optional. Picking the wrong subclass does not mean you're falling behind. The only metric of success is, did you have a good time? At least that's the theory. Because here's what could be at risk: the culture around the game, especially the expectations new players arrive with and the way the community talks about what matters. So, how did we get here? Where did optimization culture come from? In 1999, a game called EverQuest pioneered something that would change multiplayer gaming forever. It evolved into what you might know as the Holy Trinity: tank, healer, and damage dealer, or DPS. One player absorbs hits, the tank, one heals them, the healer, and everyone else kills the enemy before the healer and the tank run out of resources. It's simple, it's elegant, and when World of Warcraft launched, they basically turned it into some kind of art form. This pattern has many advantages, which explains why game designers adopted it. It defines clear roles. You know exactly what you're supposed to do. It creates interdependence. Like, you literally cannot succeed without your teammates doing their part. And also, it makes success legible, meaning you can immediately tell whether you're performing well, with big flashy numbers popping at your face. And that legibility turned out to matter a lot. Because once success became measurable, players started, measuring it. Incredible. Yes, I know. People started reverse engineering the game's math. They built spreadsheets calculating damage per second and identified which town builds were optimal and which were actually kind of traps. Choices that seemed fine, but would actually cost you like 15% of your potential output if you took them. And this knowledge didn't really stay optional. Researchers studying World of Warcraft found that theory crafting caused what they called a standardization of behaviors. If you showed up to a dungeon or raid without having studied the current meta, you took the risk of being excluded entirely. Maybe you were not bad at playing per se, but if you hadn't done your homework before playing, people didn't want to waste time with you. The game started to require preparation that happened outside of it. And before we go back to D&D and TTRPGs in general, there is one other WoW phenomenon we need to briefly discuss, because we'll need it later. In 2009, Blizzard introduced something called the Dungeon Finder. Before this, finding a group required at least some level of social investment. You could talk to your guild or message some friends, and sometimes you even had to stand in a city for an hour and whisper to strangers, trying to assemble your group. The Dungeon Finder kinda killed this. You'd click a button, get a group, and be teleported to the dungeon immediately. And this changed the game's culture almost immediately. The go, go, go era started, where efficiency became the thing. Strangers had no patience or tolerance for someone just learning specific fights or playing in a suboptimal way. Okay, cool, but if we're looking at MMOs to better understand what's happening to D&D, I wondered, are all MMOs like this? Final Fantasy XIV has the same Holy Trinity, but a completely different culture. I've actually played both, and while you will get kicked or struggle to find groups if your numbers and gear aren't great. But in FF14, kicking someone for low damage might get you in trouble. This tells us something important. The mechanics of a game don't automatically determine its culture. The infrastructure around the game and its social dynamics do. The expectations players bring and the systems that reinforce them matter a lot. So keep that in mind, because if D&D's rules explicitly moved away from video game design with 5e, like we'll see in a second, the community, well, that's a different story. By the way, if you're looking for a quick way to make your D&D fights more interesting by improving how they feel, I made something called Streets and Stakes. It's a D&D urban combat toolkit with 15 locations that all come with atmosphere, environmental actions, and round-by-round escalation clocks to help you make your fights feel alive. You can either get it by itself or as part of my Patreon membership, so just check out the link in the description. Alright, so D&D and video games have been talking to each other for a long time. D&D originally inspired the first computer RPGs, which inspired MMOs, which eventually inspired Wizards of the Coast. In 2008, they released D&D's 4th edition with a deliberate choice. Mike Mearls, who would later become lead designer, said, "I believe that MMOs played a role in how the game was shaped. I think there was a feeling that D&D needed to move into the MMO space as quickly as possible." In 4th edition, characters now had explicit roles: defender, striker, controller, and leader. If this sounds familiar, well, that's normal. Another thing is, in 4e, every ability was categorized as either at will, encounter, or daily. WoW was popular, so D&D tried to get in on the success. It makes sense, right? But the backlash was immediate and kinda brutal. People started calling it WoW pen and paper, and many players complained that numbers were taking too much space. 4th edition sold well at first, but then player retention collapsed. Mearls later said this about what went wrong. It really became about the rules and about mastering the rules, rather than about the story or role-playing or the interaction between the DM and the players. So yeah, the D&D MMO experiment failed, and WotC actually learned their lesson. Because in 2014, for the 5th edition, the designers explicitly course-corrected. Again, Mearls said, "The biggest challenge has been training ourselves to stop looking to rules to answer everything. We have solved problems by removing rules and simplifying the game." So you probably already know that D&D's 5th edition became the most commercially successful D&D release ever. So this means that if you give people more narrative flexibility and don't put your energy in developing many video game mechanics, you're good, and that the game itself will reject MMOification, right? Well, yeah, except, again, the community didn't really get the memo. The rules might have changed, but the culture's approach to those rules changed even faster, because of 3 things which happened mostly by accident, and that I think kinda imported optimization culture through the back door. The first thing is the interface. I think the emergence of virtual tabletops played a big role here. When you play D&D on, say, Roll20 or Foundry, the screen starts to look like this. Every ability on your character sheet becomes clickable. You can click to attack, cast spells, make skill checks, etc. The math happens automatically. And this causes reactions like this one I found on a forum when people go back to the table. This user says, "I was shocked at how it was harder to track everything and do lengthy addition in my head like I used to. VTTs had spoiled me by handling all the math and fiddly bits." And that's because interfaces modify behavior at scale. The scale part is very important, and we'll come back to that. It's true both for YouTube and Instagram layouts, and for people playing D&D in virtual tabletops. When software handles mechanics automatically, they become the most visible layer of the game because it's what you interact with, and the thing you click quickly becomes the thing you think about the most. So even if the rules got simpler with 5e, the way many players experienced those rules became more programmatic. The second thing that helped optimization culture spread within D&D is who you're playing with. Traditionally, D&D was played with friends, or at least people you knew outside the game. That's how I started. That's probably how you started if you've been playing for a while. And those people would, forgive you for making a suboptimal choice because you thought it fit your character. But this changed. Over 300,000 people follow Reddit's RLFG, which is short for looking for group. And DMs are a rare thing. The shortage is so bad that an entire industry has even popped up to try and solve it. On sites like startplaying.games, there are pro DMs running games full-time because thousands of players literally cannot find a free game to join. And playing with strangers produces different dynamics than playing with friends. Games with strangers tend to be very focused and cordial, but since you don't actually know the people you're playing with, the friendly atmosphere is gone. It almost feels transactional in a way. And another consequence is, just like in MMOs, finding a group now often requires applying. It can be submitting a character concept for DM approval, or even a full character sheet sometimes. And so we quickly started to see behaviors emerge that really look a lot like MMO guild recruitment practices. The third optimization Trojan horse is where new players learn to play. If you're building your first D&D character, especially if you're gonna play with strangers online, and you want advice, where do you go? There's an entire content ocean built on the premise that some character choices are correct and others should be approached with caution. Many videos explaining which subclasses are actually good and which ones will ruin your character. Now, maybe you don't like 5th edition, but the truth is, its math is actually pretty flat, meaning the power gap between an optimized character and an unoptimized one exists, sure, but it is smaller than any previous edition and than what you find in a lot of other TTRPGs, meaning you're probably not going to break the game by picking the wrong option. But a lot of the content doesn't reflect that. It's easy for a beginner to feel like there are right and wrong answers, and that they should do some kind of research or fall behind. But why do people watch this, then? I actually think there's a psychological reason. Optimization satisfies what psychology researchers call competence needs, meaning the desire to feel like you're good at something. And it does it in a very clear way. When you deal 47 damage, the feedback is instant and the number proves you're useful. If we look at roleplay on the other hand, when you deliver some kind of emotional monologue, you have to read faces, guess, and, hope. You do get feedback, but it's more subtle and more ambiguous. So because of this uncertainty, many people tend to focus on the layer of the game where success is more obvious and measurable. And I believe the content ecosystem kind of feeds that instinct, and it plays a role in shaping what new players think the game is about. These three factors played a key role, because they all feed on each other. It's easier to play with strangers online than in person. And because you don't know the people, you want to be more prepared. So you watch more content, etc., etc. But how did this cycle become so central? Well, I mentioned something earlier in the video, which acted as an accelerant. In March 2020, the world shut down. And D&D exploded. The game's sales jumped 33%, and Roll20 users logged over 100 million hours in a single quarter. Millions of new players were stuck at home and found out about D&D for the first time through screens. And with strangers on interfaces that looked more and more like video games, watching content in between sessions. All the pieces we discussed might have been there before, but the pandemic accelerated these phenomena we discussed. Some people actually studied groups that moved from in-person D&D to VTTs, and they found those people had mostly negative sentiment. They described it as feeling like a work meeting, and I can kind of relate to this, to be honest. But normalization matters. Before COVID, to a lot of us, virtual tabletop was kind of the backup option if you couldn't meet in person. After it, it became a more acceptable option to players who were first reluctant to try it. I think playing in person adds friction, sure, but I believe that it also protects part of what is so special about D&D and TTRPGs in general, which is social dynamics. Being in the same room and able to read body language or to pass snacks is cool, and those things are a lot harder to do over Discord. And for many players, playing in person was either never there, like if they started online and stuck with it, or never came back after COVID. All of this contributed to this MMOification of D&D. But at this point, I think someone's going to raise an objection. And to be honest, I think it's a good one. When making this video, I couldn't help but think about this famous D&D forum post people have been referring to for a very long time. Back in the mid-2000s, someone going with a screen name Tempest Stormwind made an argument that became so influential it got named after them. The Stormwind fallacy goes something like this. Just because someone optimizes their character mechanically does not mean they can't also roleplay well, and vice versa. It's so famous now that just mentioning it often ends discussions. And that is because, yes, on the logical level, it's true. Any individual player can absolutely care about both building a character dealing massive amounts of damage and playing that character with emotional depth. These two things aren't opposed skills, but the Stormwind fallacy describes individual capacity. It doesn't describe what happens to a culture when scale enters the stage and certain behaviors get amplified. The question isn't whether individuals can do both, because yeah, of course they can. The question is, which one does the surrounding culture make the starting point and gets rewarded by the infrastructure? And in the end, which one do new players learn to prioritize first? So here's what I keep coming back to. Most D&D players who have tried both say they prefer playing in person, but literal millions play online, because that's where a lot of the groups are. And finding a group is one of the hardest things to do if you want to get into the hobby. So, new players arrive with pre-existing video game baggage, games where you can win. They stumble upon the VTTs and the videos promoted by the YouTube algorithm. Hello there. They find the Reddit communities, and that causes the aggregate behavior to slowly change, even if individuals still have control over their personal behavior. So, the infinite possibilities and the human connection thing, they're still there. Nobody is stopping us. But I think there is a risk of it becoming the exception instead of the expectation. You can still make that choice, but it has to be a more and more active one. Kind of like fighting against the current. But here's where I think the story takes a surprising turn. In 2023, a little video game you might have heard about called Baldur's Gate 3 launched. Its engine is based on D&D 5th edition's rules. Pretty much the same classes, spells, and mechanics, translated into a video game with minor adjustments. It sold over 20 million copies and won Game of the Year at practically every awards show, while becoming a true cultural phenomenon. It doesn't happen that often. People who don't play games were suddenly asking about it. And here's what I found surprising after everything we discussed. Baldur's Gate 3 is extremely tactical. You even literally have a tactician mode. Combat is detailed and positioning matters. The game rewards build optimization, and you have the infinite wall of content and guides, the tier lists, etc. It looks frankly like exactly the video gamification of D&D that we've spent this entire video discussing. But that's not what the game is celebrated for. Not really. People loved that it had characters so unique they could actually fall in love with them. The relationships between them and your player character feel earned. When you play the game, you might get emotional over what happens in the story or feel really bad about specific choices you make. Like the terrible one I made in that refugee camp in Act 1 in my first run-through. The game is very similar mechanically, but it combines tactical depth with emotional storytelling. You get both optimization that affects the game in a fun way and narrative moments that stick with you. Everyone noticed that BG3 was special, and even Wizards of the Coast added things to the D&D 2024 rules that looked very familiar to BG3 players, like weapon mastery. And I think it's a good idea to take a quick moment and think about what's happening here. We talked about how D&D inspired the first computer RPGs, that inspired MMOs, and then about how MMO culture bled back into D&D's community, which led to 4th edition trying to embrace the same principles, triggering backlash, and leading to 5th edition, which pulled back. And now we have a video game adaptation of 5th edition, influencing the next version of the tabletop rules, and showing players that a cool story and great characters are very important. So when I started researching this video, I thought I was going to be telling a story about corruption, for lack of a better word, and how something I loved was slowly losing some of its magic. But I'm not sure that's right anymore. Baldur's Gate 3 is proof that optimization and narrative depth can not only coexist, but take a game to new heights. The dialogue between the two mediums has simply gotten more intense, with a quicker feedback loop. And society in general looks very different from what it did even 10 years ago. So the answer to did D&D become a video game is not yes or no. I think the answer is another more useful question. Which version are you playing? I'm not talking about which edition or system here. I mean, how do you play? What's your game about? The community that obsesses over builds and tier lists and mathematical optimization and only plays online is playing D&D. Just like the table where someone cries during a character moment and nobody rolls dice for 3 hours can also be playing D&D. Maybe you hate WotC after the OGL fiasco and moved to a different system altogether, or to OSR. And if you're having fun, good. This is not just about D&D. All the TTRPGs share the same special thing. They rely on a human being who can say yes and or no but to everything you try to do, and allow everyone playing them to create an infinite world. And all of that is still there. We're dealing with imagination here, so no rules can remove that. And adding software like VTTs can't change that. But you do have to choose it. And go for it. You need to actively choose to remember that a game with no win conditions doesn't need to be played like one that does. The question isn't whether D&D became a video game, but what do you want it to be? And if you do want to explore the more narrative aspects of the game, click on this video next to learn this simple question, which will make your next character 10x better.